Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Olive is having problems getting to sleep at night. She believes that exposure to blue light from her phone before she goes to bed might have an influence on how long it takes her to get to sleep and the quality of sleep that she gets. Olive records the quality of her sleep using a Likert scale of 1 being poor sleep and 7 being high quality sleep for a week, and decides to use a specialised blue light for 10 minutes before going to sleep. State an operationalised directional hypothesis for Olive's study, 2 marks. Here we have the command word state, which means you need a couple of sentences on this. This is clear and directed. We've got some key terminology here that we need to be familiar with in order to show off our psychological knowledge. The first is operationalised. This is how we're going to measure each of our variables. We need both conditions on an IV and the outcome for the DV, particularly if there is a discrete unit of measurement or score. The other mark comes from our hypothesis being directional. We need to specifically state a directional outcome in order to meet this requirement. Let's have a look at our hypothesis. Exposure to a blue light before going to sleep will have a lower sleep satisfaction score out of 7 than not being exposed to a blue light before going to sleep. We get our first mark for being directional in saying that there will be a lower score. We get our second mark for giving both outcomes for the IV, exposure to a blue light or not being exposed to the blue light, as well as the sleep satisfaction score out of 7, and we must say out of 7. Explain how Olive could improve the validity of her study, 2 marks. Let's break down our question. Firstly, we've got the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed, thorough description. We've also got in this question how and an improvement. So we know with how, we need to put ourselves in the position of the researcher, and for improvement, we've got to say what specifically we're going to improve, how we're actually going to do that with some specific details, and then why that is an improvement. In addition to that, the focus of this question is validity, which means we need to improve the accuracy of this study, or how the researcher has measured what they intended to measure, or improving that measurement strategy. We get 1 mark for our improvement in context, our what and our how, and a further mark of justifying why that improves validity. Let's have a look at an answer. Olive could ensure that she has her room at the same temperature by setting the thermostat at 16 degrees C. As if the room is hotter one night, then it may reduce the quality of the sleep that she had during the night rather than the blue light affecting her sleep. So we've got what we're going to improve, the temperature of the room. We've got how we're going to improve it, setting the thermostat at 16 degrees. And then we're justifying why this is improving validity, because if it's hotter one night, she might reduce the quality of her sleep, and therefore it's not a causal relationship for the blue light. Here we've got some data. Table 1 shows us the mean and standard deviation for the effect of blue light on sleep. Blue light has a mean of 2.7 and a standard deviation of 1.43. The control group has a mean of 3.5 and a standard deviation of 0.9. Explain 2 conclusions about the effect of blue light on sleep, 4 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description. We also have some key psychological terminology here in terms of conclusions. We get 1 mark for identifying each of our conclusions, and we get a second mark for justifying that conclusion using data from Table 1. Let's have a look at an answer. The mean of 3.5 in the control condition suggests that the quality of sleep that Olive has without the blue light is better than when she does have the blue light, as a lower score suggests poorer sleep. We've identified our conclusion here that sleeping without the blue light is better for the quality of sleep that Olive gets. We've justified that by saying that the mean score for the control group is higher. And then we need to move on to our second conclusion. The standard deviation of the blue light condition is more spread out than the control condition, as there is a difference of 0.53. So the improvement in the quality of her sleep without the blue light is more consistent. Again, we've identified a specific conclusion that the quality of her sleep without the blue light is more consistent. We've justified that with data by looking at the difference between the two standard deviations. We've also identified that with the blue light, it is more spread out. You can just lift the data from the table and do not need to manipulate it as we have done with the second conclusion that we've given. Be careful if you are adding, subtracting, manipulating the data in any way that you are accurate in how you have done this. Olive decides to use the mean as her measure of central tendency. Briefly evaluate the use of the mean, 2 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, but it is only brief and it's 2 marks. This means we only need to focus on strengths and weaknesses. Be aware that in some questions they might just use the phrase measure of central tendency rather than specifying mean, median or mode, so you need to have a connection between these two things. You get 1 mark for identifying a strength or weakness and a 2nd mark for justifying why that is a strength or weakness. As we have a STEM question here, we will need to have that weakness or strength in the context of Olive's study, all about sleep. Let's have a look at an answer. The mean is affected by extreme scores, which may skew the data, so one very poor night's sleep may give the picture that Olive's sleep generally isn't good, making the mean unrepresentative of her sleep for the week. We've clearly identified a weakness in that the mean is affected by extreme scores. However, we need the context of how this would have an impact. So one very poor night's sleep is where we actually get our identification mark. We then justify this by saying that the mean is then unrepresentative of her sleep, affecting the validity and generalizability of these results if we wanted to do that extra additional step further. Explain what Olive should include in the discussion section of her scientific report, 3 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description of the discussion section. Now, this is a key term within psychology, and so we need to know what is included in the discussion section. Because this is a STEM-based question, we also need to have this all linked into Olive's study, and all of our marks are AO2 marks or application marks. Let's have a look at an answer. The discussion section includes the relationship between the findings and conclusions of her study on the impact of blue light on quality of sleep and previous research into exogenous Zeitgebers and sleep. So we have an understanding of what is included in a discussion section with the relationship between previous research, and then we've linked this into Olive's particular study about blue light and exogenous Zeitgebers or outside influences on sleep. Olive should include the strengths and weaknesses of her methodology, including how she selected the sample and whether using a Likert scale would give her information that she needed from the participants. Again, we've got the knowledge of a discussion section here, but this wouldn't necessarily give us marks unless we applied it to Olive's study. And we've done that here by talking about her Likert scale that she used. And finally, it should include what research Olive would do next to explore the role of blue light and sleep, such as whether using a blue light directly before going to sleep affected sleep quality compared to leaving it 10 minutes in darkness after using the blue light. So we have our final understanding of what should be included in a discussion section, so what to do next, the next area for research, and we have linked this into Olive's study by giving an example of what she might do next. Dr. Patel is a psychologist studying whether virtual reality, VR, can increase empathy towards people experiencing homelessness. She recruits 80 volunteers aged 18 to 25 from a university campus. Half of the participants wear a VR headset and experience a simulation showing a day in the life of a homeless person, including searching for shelter and interacting with passers-by. The other half watch a standard documentary about homelessness on a laptop. Afterward, all the participants complete a questionnaire measuring empathy levels and willingness to donate money to homelessness charities. Explain how Dr. Patel could implement an independent group's design. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which means we need a detailed description. We've also got how, which means we need to put ourselves in Dr. Patel's position and practically give steps about implementing. There's also some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what independent groups or independent measures design is. There's 2 marks here, so we need 2 steps in the design and implementation, and both of those need to be linked into the STEM and the focus of Dr. Patel's study. These are all application marks. Let's have a look at our answer. Dr. Patel could put all the volunteers from the university into a hat and randomly assign them to either the VR headset or the documentary condition. Dr. Patel could put the first name into the VR condition and the next into the documentary until she has 40 participants in each condition. We've got that all the participants are from a university, which would give us some application marks, and that they've been randomly assigned, that's part of an independent group's design, into either of the 2 conditions, and we've specified those. Just using the name Dr. Patel is not enough because that is in the question. We've then been clear that the first name is going to go into the VR condition and the next into the documentary, and we've talked about 40 participants in total. All of this is from our STEM. A group of psychologists conduct research into the impact of music on worldviews. They select students from 3 sixth forms using a random number generator using students' candidate numbers. They are asked to answer a questionnaire about their views on a number of world issues, including climate change. Students record their answer on a Likert scale, recording whether they strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree to the statements given. The students are then exposed to 30 minutes of either heavy metal or reggaeton music via headphones and then asked to repeat the questionnaire. Both the types of music selected were not consistent with their usual music preferences. Students were tested 1 week later using a different range of statements about a number of world issues, including views on gender equality. A world view score was recorded out of 100 based on an average score between the 2 questionnaires. A higher worldview score showing more positive worldviews and a lower worldview score showing more negative worldviews. The results from the worldview study for the heavy metal music condition are shown in Table 1. Complete Table 1 and calculate the standard deviation for the worldview study to 3 significant figures, 4 marks. Here we have the command words complete and calculate. Here we need to calculate using our calculator and complete the mathematical skills that we've been asked to do in the question. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this study in how we calculate standard deviation as a measure of dispersion. Standard deviation tells us how spread out the scores are around the mean. Our first job is to calculate the mean. This means we need to add up all the scores and then divide it by the number of scores. So we need to add up all the values in the world scores column, and this is all for the heavy music condition. So we're going to do 17 plus 55 plus 61 plus 63 plus 47 plus 18 plus 32 plus 10 plus 71 plus 22. So that equals 396. And then we're going to divide that by the number of scores, which is 10, to give us 96.3. And we're going to divide that by 10 to give us 39.6. So our first mark is to complete this column, x minus the mean. Where we're talking about x, that's our data score. So we're going to do 17 minus 39.6, which equals minus 22.6. And then we're going to do that for each single data score. And then we need to square each of these values in our first column. So we're going to do minus 22.6 squared, and this final column should not have any negative values. And then for our third mark, what we need to do is complete this by doing the sum of that x minus the mean squared column. So we're going to add up this column here with all of our numbers. And that equals 4,504.4. We can then complete the formula that we're given in the front of our booklet, and we do get a mark for writing it out and substituting all the values. So we're going to do the square root of 4,504.4 divided by n, which is 10 minus 1, so that's 9. So we need to do this calculation first before we do our square root, and then that gives us our final answer of 21.2. In some questions, you might just be given the data table, like where it says worldview score, and then I would write in these other two columns so that you know that you've completed all of the skills necessary to do the standard deviation. Identify the likelihood of a type 1 error at a level of significance of p equals less than or equal to 0.05, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which is looking for a particular statement. This question has some assumed psychological knowledge in terms of what a type 1 error is. This is a false positive. It means that we have incorrectly accepted the alternate hypothesis in error and should have rejected it. But this question is looking for what type or what likelihood there is that we've made an error. And for this, we need to focus on our level of significance, which always tells us the likelihood of a type 1 error. We're converting this decimal into a ratio in order to talk about likelihood. The likelihood of a type 1 error is 1 in 20. So we've taken 5 in 100 and we've simplified that to 1 in 20. A research team are interested in whether belief in the paranormal was affected by culture. A self-selected sample of 10 participants was recruited from a university campus in the UK, Japan, America and Brazil. They were interviewed about what beliefs they held about the paranormal using a semi-structured interview. All the participants were asked about their beliefs on ghosts, faith healing, and their beliefs on life after death. As part of the interview, the participants were also asked about any other beliefs that they held as an opportunity to gain new insights on paranormal beliefs that the research team might not be aware of. The research team collected quantitative data in the number of beliefs held about pre-existing paranormal beliefs. They also collected qualitative data, recording the responses that the participants gave to the open-ended question about any additional beliefs that the participants had. Explain one strength of collecting qualitative data in the paranormal beliefs study, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. The focus of this question is a strength, and so all of our marks need to come from describing a strength. The assumed knowledge in this question is that we understand what qualitative data is. There are 2 marks in this question, and we get 1 mark for identifying a particular strength of qualitative data. Because this is a STEM question, that strength needs to be linked into the paranormal belief study. Therefore, this becomes an AO2 mark. Our second mark is then to justify that, to say why that is a strength for this particular piece of research. Time to have a look at a response. By collecting qualitative data, the research team can access information about the meaning paranormal beliefs have for individuals, increasing the validity as the researchers understand what beliefs are held and why participants have them. We've identified our strength in that our qualitative data gets the meaning behind individual paranormal beliefs. We've justified that by saying that this increases the validity of the study and we understand what beliefs are held and why they are held. Explain how the research team could analyse their qualitative data, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in that we understand what qualitative data is. This is written data, and we can remember that by the L in qualitative. This question is focused on how we're going to analyse that data, or how we're going to break it down in order to draw some findings out and understand this piece of research. As this question has a stem, we need two separate ways or two separate ideas for our two AO2 marks. Both need to be linked into the context of our stem in order for us to gain lots of marks for this particular response. Let's have a look at our answer. The research team could create behavioural categories for the additional paranormal beliefs held by the participants. For example, being able to move objects or communicate with dead people. We've demonstrated our understanding of qualitative data analysis by talking about behavioural categories. We've then linked this into the STEM by giving particular paranormal beliefs that we'd be creating those behavioural categories about. We're going to tick this off in our STEM in order to show a variety of application skills. We need a second idea in order to get our second mark. The research team could tally the number of times that behavioural categories appear in the transcriptions of the participants' responses to the question about additional beliefs to compare them cross-culturally. We've understood that in qualitative data analysis, we need to tally up the times that a particular category appears. We've linked this back into the STEM, not only talking about the response to the open question, but the aim of this piece of research in order to study cross-cultural beliefs. We've returned back to the aim of the study in order to get our second application mark. A psychologist is interested in the development of helping behaviours in children in preschool. They believe that children who are raised by parents who have pro-social professions, such as nursing, are more likely to be pro-social with their peers than children who are raised by parents who have competitive professions, such as a stockbroker. The psychologist collects information about the parent's profession through sending a questionnaire home to 10 local primary schools with a nursery. A series of closed questions are asked, including the critical question of the profession of each parent, which is then coded as pro-social, competitive, or neither. The psychologist then conducts a study with each child to determine whether they were helpful. A child of a similar age, but who wears a different uniform, walks past the child and then drops the books they were carrying on the floor. The psychologist then records whether the preschooler helped to pick up the books or not. Explain how the psychologist could use opportunity sampling in the helping behaviours study. 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which is asking us to give detail and extension within our discussion. It has some assumed psychological knowledge in that we understand what opportunity sampling is. And this question is focused on how we would conduct that sample. So we need to put ourselves in the position of the researcher and how specifically we would do that if we were them. There's 2 marks available for these questions, but this particular question is all about application, and so it has to link into the STEM and the scenario of helping behaviours study. Let's have a look at an answer. The psychologist could go to some preschools attached to a hospital and some in affluent areas in order to access parents with pro-social and professional jobs. The children that attended the preschool on the day that the psychologist attends would be participants in the study. We need 2 separate links to the STEM. So we've started by saying that we're going to access preschools attached to a hospital and in affluent areas. We've used information from our STEM here for our 2 different types of parents, having nurses with our pro-social behaviours and stockbrokers are more competitive. We understand that opportunity sampling is about whoever has attended on a given day, and we've put that into context by thinking about this as preschoolers, and so that shows that we've understood beyond what's in the question. We're going to highlight in here that we've got a nursery for our sample. Table 1 shows the frequency of preschool children who completed a pro-social behaviour based on their parents' profession. Of those children who helped pick up the books, 60 had pro-social parents and 17 had competitive parents. Of those children who didn't help pick up the books, 46 had pro-social parents and 75 had competitive parents. Using research evidence, explain how far realistic conflict theory could account for the findings of the pro-social behaviour study, 6 marks. The command word for this question is explain, so we need to give a detailed and developed answer in order to respond to this command word. It also has some assumed psychological knowledge in terms of realistic conflict theory and that we understand this theory. We need to link these into particular findings that we have been given from our data set. And all of that needs to apply to this particular study in terms of pro-social behaviours. So we get 3 marks for our AO2, linking those findings into realistic conflict theory, and 3 marks for explaining how far those findings are justifiable using research. Let's have a look at a response. Realistic conflict theory would explain why children with competitive parents have less pro-social behaviours, 17 helping to pick up the books, than those with pro-social behaviours, 60 helping to pick up the books. As those with competitive parents are more likely to see the child in a different uniform as an outgroup and therefore are less likely to be helpful. Sharif et al.'s research supports this conclusion, as they found when competition was used to create friction between the eagles and the rattlers, there was less intergroup friendship between the groups, with only 6.4% of eagles having rattlers as friends. We've started our response by picking out a finding, and we've compared competitive parents and pro-social parents in terms of the number of children who helped. We've picked out these figures within our response. We've then identified a concept within realistic conflict theory in terms of an outgroup. And we've linked that into one of our conditions of competitive parents, that competitive parents are more likely to see that child as an outgroup. We've then justified this with Sharif et al.'s research, giving specific findings that would support the fact that realistic conflict theory would explain this particular study. We're then going to move on to a new finding. Realistic conflict theory would explain why children with pro-social parents are more likely to help the outgroup child to pick up the book than didn't help pick up the book. As 60 children helped pick up the books compared to 46 who didn't help pick up the books. The children may have been encouraged to have superordinate goals from their parents' careers. Aronson and Bridgman found that the implementation of the jigsaw classroom helped increase academic achievement and reduce prejudicial behaviour. If we return to Table 1, we're now looking at the pro-social behaviours and pro-social parents, and their children's behaviours. So this time we're focusing on findings of the pro-social parents, saying that the pro-social parents are likely to produce children who are more likely to help. We've used figures from the table in order to support this conclusion. We've linked this into terminology from superordinate goals, but we're still talking about the parents' careers in order to link this back into the study. We've supported that with research from Aronson and Bridgman, saying that including superordinate goals is positive and encourages helpful behaviour and less prejudice. Because our question says explain how far, we're actually going to give an alternative strategy that isn't from realistic conflict theory. Social learning theory could be an alternative explanation of the results, with the parents modelling expectations to their children of how to behave, which is replicated by the children within the pro-social behaviour study, explaining why 60 children helped to pick up the books. Bandura et al. 1961 found that same-sex role models are influential for behaviour, as boys were more likely to imitate aggression by a same-sex model. The parent who is the same sex of the child may have more of an influence over behaviour, and whether they have a pro-social profession may encourage the child to help pick up the books. Our alternative theory has come from social learning theory. However, you could do anything as long as it's not realistic conflict theory. We've still looked into this as a result. We've gone for social learning theory here as our alternative, but you could use any theory as long as it's not realistic conflict theory, and you can link it into those findings. This time we've used key terminology from social learning theory in terms of modelling the behaviour, and link this into the findings that 60 children from the pro-social behaviours category on pro-social parents picked up the books. We've justified this with findings from Bandura et al.'s 1961 study, and again we've said that it's the same-sex parent that might be important in terms of their profession and the helping behaviours of the children. Evaluate how the classic studies of Watson and Rayner 1920 and Rosenhan 1973 might be considered socially sensitive, 16 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is sneaky in Edexcel psychology, because we need to do both skills, explanation and evaluation. We get AO1 marks for both explaining Watson and Rayner's study, or Rosenhan's study, or key terminology for socially sensitive research. There are 6 marks available for our AO1 and 10 marks for evaluating the extent to which both classic studies are socially sensitive or aren't socially sensitive. Let's have a look at a response. Sieber and Stanley suggest that the phrasing of the research question can be used to target specific groups within society, making them a target for prejudice and discrimination after the research has been published. We've conducted our AO1 by explaining socially sensitive research, and it's critical that we talk about Sieber and Stanley. One of the ways in which it might be socially sensitive is about the research question. It's also key when we talk about socially sensitive research that we focus on this being after publication rather than during the design of the study. We're then going to move into discussing how each classic study may be considered socially sensitive. The focus of Rosenhan's study on the work of clinicians may have made them feel incompetent, as he aimed to reveal deep flaws within the process of psychiatric diagnosis. We've identified here that clinicians are the focus of our socially sensitive research. We've also demonstrated our understanding of Rosenhan's study by giving the aim of this particular piece of research. This could be credited as AO1. We then want to explain how the research question might be problematic or socially sensitive. Rosenhan's research question needed to focus on the work of psychiatry in general rather than specific hospitals or clinicians to avoid making them a target. Rosenhan's findings that all of the same patients were diagnosed with a clinical condition, with most being diagnosed with schizophrenia, suggests that there may be prejudice towards clinicians about their ability to diagnose. The follow-up study may have further embarrassed clinicians, as 41 of the 193 patients were believed to be fake despite no pseudopatients being sent. We've stated how Rosenhan's study is not socially sensitive in that the research question focused on psychiatry in general. We've also identified that the clinicians may be viewed as a target, both for the fact that they misdiagnosed and the clinical condition which they diagnosed them with. Clear understanding of the nature of Rosenhan's follow-up study has been talked about, and the impact of this on our understanding of socially sensitive research. We then want to move into looking at Watson and Rayner's study. In addition, Watson and Rayner would need to be cautious about the phrasing of their research question, as demonstrating that fear can be acquired through classical conditioning may result in individuals viewing phobias less legitimate if they have been conditioned rather than evolved or genetic traits. We've focused here on the implications of fear being acquired through classical conditioning, suggesting that it may be viewed as less legitimate if it wasn't coming from genetic factors. To complete our evaluation paragraph, we want to form a judgment. The phrasing of the research question is more socially sensitive for Rosenhan's study and has significant implications for how psychiatrists are viewed and their ability to make a valid diagnosis, so vulnerable patients may not seek out the support that they need. We've given a clear judgment about viewing Rosenhan's research as more socially sensitive and discussed the implications that have gone beyond the study once it has been published, both in terms of how psychiatrists are viewed and the implications that this has on wider society. It's now time to turn our attention back to our AO1 and explain different ways in which research might be considered socially sensitive. Sieber and Stanley also suggest that research may be socially sensitive if the researchers discover information during the study that should be disclosed to the police. It may be that participants disclose information within the study that should not remain confidential as it affects the public. Although we are talking about disclosures within the study, it's what we do with this information afterwards and whether it should remain confidential once we have published our research. Let's go back to evaluating and discussing this in the context of our classic studies. Again, we're going to start with Rosenhan. During Rosenhan's study, instances of physical abuse were observed by the pseudo-patients, but stopped when other staff appeared. We've clearly identified something that might need to be disclosed and not remain confidential. We then need to explain the implications of this. As such, Rosenhan has a conflict in terms of confidentiality and whether to disclose the names of staff that committed the abuse to their employers or the instances that pseudo-patients observed to the hospital, licensing boards or the police, depending on the nature of the abuse that they saw. By not reporting this, the patients may still be vulnerable to abuse, but Rosenhan would need to breach the confidentiality of the hospitals that were visited that may result in other hospitals not taking part in future research. We've used our knowledge to show both who Rosenhan might disclose to and the implications on both sides of the debate, that patients remain vulnerable to abuse if Rosenhan doesn't disclose and breach confidentiality, but that other hospitals might not take part in research if he does. It's now time to develop our discussion in relation to Watson and Rayner's research. However, Watson and Rayner's study was not socially sensitive as they ensured the identity of little Albert by using a pseudonym to protect his identity, and the level of harm that he experienced within the study was similar to every day, as a loud bang was made with 2 wooden blocks. The recording of little Albert during the study suggests that his identity may not have been protected after publication, as he is clearly visible, although there would have been difficulties in recognising an 11-month-old child. Again, both how Watson and Rayner's research is and isn't socially sensitive has been outlined. It isn't socially sensitive because of the protections to his identity, and the fact that within the study it was a similar level of harm being experienced. However, we've said that there is footage of little Albert where he's clearly visible, and then we've countered it again by talking about difficulties in recognising him. There may also be some dispute over whether little Albert was still alive when the publications happened. To complete this evaluation paragraph, what we want to do is come to another judgment. Rosenhan's study is more socially sensitive than Watson and Rayner's, as disclosures made in the study may affect the treatment of the wider public by clinicians. We've been clear in our judgment, and we've said why this has an impact. It's time to return once again to our knowledge of a socially sensitive research as a debate. Sieber and Stanley suggest that the institutional context may cause the research to be socially sensitive. The expectations of the bodies that fund research and the stipulations that they place on researchers may skew the results and applications of research once it has been published. Here we're clearly talking about who might fund research and what implications this might have, that these might skew the results and applications. Those organisations that fund research have their own identities and their own aspirations for that particular piece of research, and researchers need to be really cautious about this. We then need to consider this aspect of socially sensitive research within the context of our 2 classic studies. The APA is a significant body within clinical research and is unlikely to fund research that suggests that clinicians are unable to accurately diagnose. Here we've identified the American Psychological Association as someone who might fund, or an organisation that might fund research. We then want to explain this within the context of Rosenhan's study. As the DSM generates income for the APA through book and digital sales of the classification manual, and so the APA is unlikely to fund research that supports that diagnosis is not valid. The acceptance of Rosenhan's conclusions that the segregated and depersonalised environment are situational factors that see individuals as insane, and the promotion of less medical environment could lead to a greater therapeutic effects, and led to critical reforms in the publication of the DSM-3. We've clearly identified why we want to be cautious about the APA funding research, in that the DSM generates income for them. The fact that the DSM made critical reforms after the publication of Rosenhan's research suggests that they might be okay or less biased as a funding body. Now let's consider Watson and Rayner's study. However, pharmaceutical companies have significant funds to shape psychological research, which results in less focus on behavioural therapies such as systematic desensitization, even when they are effective. Gilroy et al. Found that when systematic desensitization was used with a phobia of spiders, individuals had less fear than a control group. The impact was positive both 3 and 33 months later. We've identified here that pharmaceutical companies are a different organisation that might fund research, and the impact of this on looking at the effectiveness of behavioural therapies. We then clearly outlined systematic desensitisation as a therapy developed from Watson and Rayner's research, and that it has a positive impact on phobias. Let's complete this evaluation paragraph with a judgment. The funding and exploration of psychology is limited by those bodies that are funding research, with less investment in situational factors and talking therapies. We've clearly identified that both the focus of Watson and Rayner and Rosenhan's study may have less investment from those organisations that have a significant funding power in psychological research. Let's return to AO1 one more time. It is not that research shouldn't be done, but attention should be paid to the biases that might affect the research. These will affect the interpretation of findings and how these have been applied to different populations. The role of biases is identified as an additional factor that might make research socially sensitive. It's now time to discuss this in the context of our classic studies. The demand characteristics of clinicians may explain the diagnosis of psychiatrists, who would not expect individuals to falsely present symptoms. Therefore, their behaviour is a reflection of the aims of psychiatry. The biases in Rosenhan's study are creating demand characteristics within the psychiatrists, that they wouldn't expect people to falsely present symptoms, they wouldn't expect to see pseudo patients, and therefore their biases are skewing them towards a positive outcome, a type 1 error, that these patients must have something wrong with them. Rosenhan's findings increased support for the anti-psychiatry movement, and that a medical model was not appropriate when treating mental illnesses. Rosenhan has emphasised the impact of negative labels on patients that prevent recovery. So we also need to be aware of Rosenhan's stance as an anti-psychiatrist, and the fact that this created a whole movement. The fact that he emphasises the negative labels also suggests that there are some viewpoints that Rosenhan holds that may have influenced the findings of his study. Let's return once again to Watson and Rayner's research. However, Watson and Rayner's study has high internal validity to reduce the impact of bias, with little Albert being carefully selected for his emotional stability, making individual characteristics less likely to impact the result. The well-controlled room reduced the impact of situational variables, and responses to the wooded blocks as the neutral stimulus ensured that the phobic response did not affect general anxiety levels. Our counterargument has a range of ways in which Watson and Rayner's study has high levels of control to ensure that biases are not being taken into account within the research. It's time to give a conclusion here about validity. An awareness of confirmation biases is taken to account. It's now time to give a final judgment about the impact of validity. An awareness of confirmation biases is taken into account by Watson and Rayner and Rosenhan by including a null hypothesis and designing their research to reduce the impact of bias. We've given a clear conclusion about confirmation bias and how this has been reduced in both studies. To complete our response, we want to give a balanced conclusion to reflect the command word evaluate. Watson and Rayner and Rosenhan have been careful to phrase their research question in a neutral manner to avoid it being socially sensitive, but the focus on clinicians means that Rosenhan's study has the potential to be more socially sensitive. Breaking confidentiality is a significant issue from Rosenhan, as the abuse of patients was discovered during the observation. The financial power of pharmaceutical companies has had a significant impact on which therapies are offered to patients and which disorders are researched, limiting the reach of Watson and Rayner and Rosenhan's conclusions. And finally, the biases of researchers need to be checked through designing research to support the null hypothesis and falsification. Sleep is an important behaviour for all animals, although the amount of sleep varies based on their species. Sleep can be a way for animals to conserve energy, with smaller animals with lower metabolic rates sleeping more than larger animals. Alternatively, the amount of sleep that animals get could be a learnt behaviour to avoid predators. When they are prey, they must sleep less in order to avoid the danger from predators. Research has also found that the amount of sleep is determined by the amount of time needed to forage for food. Herbivores spend their time eating plants that are poor in nutrients and so must spend more time eating and less time sleeping. Evaluate the extent to which behaviour, such as sleep, can be explained by learning theories. You must make reference to the context in your answer, 12 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate. However, this is a sneaky command word because we need to explain as well. There are 4 marks available for our knowledge in this question, and our knowledge needs to focus on different learning theories, giving a detailed explanation of a range of learning theories. We then also have some application marks, and these all need to link into sleep. So we have the same amount of marks for application. How do these learning theories apply to sleep specifically? We also have 4 marks available for our evaluation. That's giving strengths and weaknesses of learning theories. Now, you don't need to know specific research for sleep because this could change. So we're talking more about research that supports or criticises different learning theories. We can also pick up AO3 marks by offering an alternative explanation for sleep that isn't based in learning theories. Let's have a look at our response. Classical conditioning explains that behaviours are learnt through association. A neutral stimulus produces no response, and an unconditioned stimulus produces a natural reflex. To create a conditioned response, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together over a period of time until the neutral stimulus produces the response without the unconditioned stimulus. At this point, it becomes a conditioned stimulus producing a conditioned response. We've got a broad range of terminology included here to explain how learning is through an association. It's really important that we include that a neutral stimulus produces no response and an unconditioned stimulus produces a natural response. We want to go through this process of before conditioning, during conditioning and after conditioning in order to give a complete response about classical conditioning. We're then going to move through and look at application. Research supports that learning is created by association in both humans and animals, so sleep has been associated with a greater likelihood of being attacked by predators, and so prey sleep less. We've got a clear link into the stem here with sleep, and we've looked at the association between being attacked by predators, and so prey sleep less. We're going to tick this off in our stem in order to show a broad range of application and that we've already used this part of the stem in order to apply our knowledge. Let's move through to some research to support the role of classical conditioning. Pavlov found that dogs learn to salivate, a natural response to the unfamiliar sound of the bell. Watson and Rayner found that fear could be conditioned through association. Little Albert learnt to have a phobia of white fluffy objects through the systematic pairing of a rat with a loud noise. We've got research findings from a range of research here, from Pavlov and from Watson and Rayner, to support that learning is through association. We're going to counteract this now, giving a counter-argument of an alternative that might explain sleep. However, sleep patterns may also be the result of biological mechanisms such as hormones. Melatonin is produced to initiate sleep, and increasing or decreasing levels may be triggered by sunlight. So our alternative here comes from hormones. We've gone for a specific hormone related to sleep, which is melatonin. However, we might know some other ones like adrenaline as a response to threat, which might be more similar with our syllabus. We're going to come to a judgment about the role of classical conditioning. Associations of when to sleep may reflect hormonal fluctuations in the body. So we've actually gone for a bit of an interactionist approach here, saying that these two things are combined together. It's time to look at a different learning theory now. Operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when a reward is added to encourage behaviour, whereas negative reinforcement is when an unpleasant feeling is removed by the behaviour. Behaviours are also changed by punishment, with positive punishment adding something to stop the behaviour, and negative punishment something being taken away to stop or prevent the behaviour. We've talked about a range of terminology here in order to understand and explain that operant conditioning is through reinforcement. Be careful about the difference between negative reinforcement and our different types of punishment. Whenever we're talking about reinforcement, we're saying we're doing things to encourage behaviours, either adding or removing things. Punishment is things to stop the behaviour. And then we're going to link this into sleep. Research supports that learning is created by reinforcement in both humans and animals, with those animals sleeping less having more time to forage for food. Here we've linked this into sleep by talking about having less sleep in order for more time to eat. This is a type of negative reinforcement, that by not doing a behaviour, not sleeping, we've got more positive in reinforcement in terms of more access to food. We've gone back up to our stem here to tick this part of our stem off, because we've linked that still into operant conditioning and learning theories. We're then going to use research to evaluate operant conditioning. Skinner encouraged rats to pull a lever by presenting them with a food pellet each time the lever was pulled. Latham and Dossip found that variable ratio pay encouraged beaver trappers to catch more beavers. Again, we focused on research findings in order to use our research for operant conditioning to evaluate. Be really careful, especially with Pavlov and Skinner, not to go into a big description about how that research was conducted, but what are the findings and how does that support our particular learning theory? We're going to give a counter-argument now and explain a problem with operant conditioning. Operant conditioning fails to take into account the role of motivation in explaining human behaviour. Sleep patterns may be different in human beings because they are motivated to stay awake at night despite the benefits of sleep and biological mechanisms encouraging sleep. A general problem with operant conditioning is that it fails to take into account motivation. We've linked this specifically back into sleep, and that we might be motivated to stay awake at night despite the benefits, particularly if we're a human being. You might want to give a specific example here, but we want to be careful not to go too far away from animals, which is the focus of our STEM. And then we're going to come to a judgment. Operant conditioning may explain the sleep patterns of animals better than those of humans, as many people suffer from sleep disorders. We've come to quite a sensitive judgment here, in that we're saying that it might be better for animals rather than humans. So although it is an explanation of sleep, it's not really generalisable. Let's look at a final learning theory. Social learning theory suggests that behaviour is learnt through observation of role models that have power and status. Attention is paid to their behaviour, which is then retained by the observer. Reproduction of the behaviour may change depending on the appropriate situation, and motivation is due to vicarious reinforcement. We've discussed a range of terminology for social learning theory, focusing on the processes of social learning through attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. However, you could absolutely talk about imitation, observation, role models, and vicarious reinforcement in a bit more detail instead. It's time to link this back into sleep. Animals have learnt sleep patterns from role models who lead the pack, as they are viewed as having successful strategies. These are then reproduced by the rest of the herd so that you have differing patterns between smaller and larger animals. So we've identified that the leader of the pack would be the role model for animals, and that we've also identified that the rest of the herd would likely to copy the pack leader. We've linked this in to our STEM and the difference between larger and smaller animals. We've returned to our STEM in order to tick this part off, that we have a difference between the smaller animals with lower metabolic rates sleeping more than larger animals. It's now time to evaluate social learning theory. There is empiricism for the role of social learning theory in encouraging behaviours and resolves the issue of motivation with other learning theories. Bandura et al. 1961 found that children who observed an aggressive role model were more likely to be aggressive. Same-sex role models were found to have more significant impact on the aggressive behaviour of boys. Again, we've talked about the role of motivation here, and we've used our research evidence. We've focused on Bandura, and again, it's really important that we focus on specific findings, so about same-sex role models and the aggressive role model, rather than giving a description of that procedure. It's time to give a counter-argument now to elaborate in our evaluation. However, cultural variations in sleep patterns may be due to evolutionary adaptations to our environment. Countries that have a siesta are often hot during the middle of the day, and sleeping during this period could save energy and resources. We've used counter-argument for cultural variations, and we've said that this might have an evolutionary advantage, so giving a counterpoint to learning theories. We've used our example of a siesta here, however you could use something else that might be more appropriate. And then we're going to come to a judgment. Cultural variations in sleep patterns shows variation and vicarious reinforcement of norms demonstrating the impact of environmental influences. Where we're talking about the role of norms, we're talking about social rules in behaviour. We've linked that back into social learning theory once again by saying that certain norms are encouraged by others. We're then going to give a final counter-argument discussing a different theory. Evolutionary theories suggest that behaviour has adapted in order to ensure the survival of the species, which is known as natural selection. They also suggest that behaviours are based on sexual selection and the encouragement of mate retention and mate competition. We've identified a theory outside of learning theories. It doesn't matter which we go for, we've just gone for evolutionary theories. We've shown a clear understanding of key terminology within this alternative approach. We're then going to link this into sleep. Herbivores sleeping less will help them survive as they have more time to spend eating to ensure that they have enough nutrients to survive and procreate. We've talked about the difference here with herbivores, saying that they spend more time eating in order to have enough nutrients to survive. We've returned to our STEM to tick this off in order to show our varied responses and application. We're then going to evaluate evolutionary theories. Cross-cultural research can support evolutionary theories, showing that similar patterns of behaviour are universal. BUS found evidence that preferences in mate choice, with males preferring younger and more attractive women. The universal nature of sleep patterns, with predators having more sleep than prey, supports that the nature of sleep may be an adaptive trait. We've given specific research that shows that behaviours is universal through BUS. As I said before, our research support doesn't have to link into the behaviour because we know that that's a real unknown from the exam board. However, we have linked this back into sleep in terms of talking about the sleep patterns of predators, and those are universal. It's time to give a counter-argument. However, evolutionary explanations do not take into account the role of culture and that some cultures may have distinct sleep patterns. There are also some prey that sleep as much as predators, such as rabbits. Cultural variations is a great way to evaluate evolutionary explanations. If things are different in different cultures, then they're suggesting that they're not universal and adaptive. It's time to give a judgment now, comparing our alternative to learning theories. The variation of sleep patterns between predators and prey shows that evolution may be a better explanation than learning theories. It's good to be definitive in our judgments to show that we've really assessed the nature of the theories that we've presented. We're now going to form a final conclusion. Evidence from research with both humans and animals supports that behaviours such as sleep can be learnt. Differences between prey and predators support an evolutionary explanation for sleep, with differences in sleep being adaptive. Biological differences in hormone levels during the night suggest that physiological differences may encourage sleep at certain points of the day or night. And finally, other factors such as age or cultural expectations may have an impact on sleep patterns. Assess the use of psychological knowledge in society, 20 marks. Here we have the command word assess. This means we still need to explain and evaluate. The major difference with an assess question is that we want to form a final judgment or a range of judgments throughout our response. We have 8 marks of our knowledge, and our knowledge is coming from our understanding of the use of psychological knowledge. We have 12 marks of evaluation, how that psychological knowledge has been used to benefit society or maybe has been problematic for society. In our 20 marker, in our final issues and debates question, we can use all examples across psychology. So although we've got examples that we've used in our essay, you can always use substitutions and alternatives in your own response. Let's have a look at an essay. Psychological understanding should help people to avoid or overcome difficulties. In understanding human behaviour, psychology has the ability to unlearn behaviour, create more rational thought processes, make changes to physiology to vary levels of neurotransmitters and hormones, or make changes to social surroundings that in turn has an impact on behaviour. We've identified a specific use for psychological knowledge in terms of overcoming or avoiding difficulties. We've then linked this in to a range of different approaches within psychology. We're going to identify now and look at our evaluation. Psychological therapies are effective in treating phobias by learning a different response to a stimulus based on reciprocal inhibition. We've started by identifying therapies generally and then gone into a specific one in terms of learning theories. We've shown our psychological knowledge here by using key terminology in terms of reciprocal inhibition. We're then going to use research to explain why we're saying that it's effective. Gilroy et al. Compared patients who received systematic desensitisation with a control group for a phobia of spiders. At 3 and 33 months later, those receiving systematic desensitisation were less fearful. We've given clear findings from specific research, showing detail in our psychological knowledge. And then we're going to give a counter-argument, also looking at therapies. However, therapies developed to treat schizophrenia are not without side effects that can be harmful to patients. Hill found that large out-of-court settlements have been made for tardive dyskinesia, the uncontrollable movements of lips, tongue, faces, hands and feet, affects 30% of patients, with 75% of conditions being irreversible. We've identified that not all psychological knowledge is useful and that therapies have side effects. We've taken ours from clinical psychology in schizophrenia, talking about the impact of tardive dyskinesia when taking antipsychotics. And then we're going to give a judgment to assess the use of psychological knowledge. Therapies do improve the symptoms of clinical conditions, and the subjective reporting from patients demonstrates that psychology has been used positively in society. We've linked this directly back to the question, in terms of it being a positive use of psychological knowledge, and that therapies are effective in terms of improving symptoms of clinical conditions. Again, you could have gone for other clinical conditions here or any therapy. And then we're going to return to explaining the use of psychological knowledge more generally. The applications of psychological knowledge can be overt, with members of society being aware that psychological techniques are being applied and still be positive. Although they are openly acknowledged, we can also be unaware of their impact or dismiss their influence on our behaviour. Here we're talking about the nature of psychological applications being overt or being known to the public. However, we're still saying these are positive and we might be unaware of their impact. So although they aren't hiding that we're trying to change behaviour, we might not necessarily acknowledge that they actually are changing our behaviour. We're then going to evaluate this with particular techniques from research. Through the work of Sharif et al. And his findings in the Robbers Cave study that prejudice can be created through competition, techniques have been developed to reduce prejudice in society through superordinate goals. We've identified the work of Sharif and the Robbers Cave study. Because we're using this for application, we're not going to go into a massive detail about the findings or procedure of this particular study. We've said that this has helped us develop techniques to reduce prejudice, having a positive application in society through including superordinate goals. We're then going to give an example from research about how this has been conducted. You could use a popular example in society instead to still show the same effect. Aronson and Bridgman developed the jigsaw classroom to reduce racial prejudice in American schools, where students had to work together and take responsibility for different parts of a group project. The technique increased outgroup empathy and improved the academic performance for minority students. We've given detail about our particular research example. It's really important here we've said the impact of this positively in society, in terms of outgroup empathy and academic performance. We're then going to give a counter-argument about how applications of psychological knowledge haven't been so positive. However, understanding of obedience has been used to justify destructive behaviours for society. Binding factors reduce moral strain, and uniform increases anonymity so that people are more likely to act aggressively, which has been shown in the level of police brutality and the lack of convictions in the USA, as you are 3 times more likely to be killed by police if you are coloured, and 99% of police killings result in no charge. We've taken our example from binding factors. Our examples here come from a key question, so you could use your key questions to show our applications of psychological knowledge to contemporary issues. It's time for another judgment about the use of psychological knowledge. Having knowledge about how prejudice and obedience can be increased can be manipulated by those in power to encourage the destructive behaviour of others, demonstrating that psychological understanding isn't always positive. We've been clear in our judgment here about how psychological knowledge hasn't been used positively. Specifically, we've talked about the manipulation of knowledge by those in power. We're going to return back to explaining different ways in which psychological knowledge can be applied. There have been abusive applications of psychological techniques to control specific groups in society and ensure that stigma remains around some clinical conditions, making it more difficult for individuals to access support. Here we've explained how psychological knowledge might be used for a negative consequence for society and control specific groups. A link to stigma is nice in order to demonstrate these negative connotations around psychological knowledge. We're then going to evaluate this with specific examples. Psychology does not operate in isolation. It can be manipulated by those in power to further their own goals. We're linking this in a little bit to social control and how this manipulation of our knowledge could have negative connotations. There's lots of different examples you can use here, but we've actually stuck with clinical psychology for this one. Those who breach social norms or challenge government policies can be labelled as mentally disturbed. The KGB in Russia pressurised psychiatrists in the 1960s to diagnose and institutionalise political opponents. We've clearly discussed the impact of this in terms of those who breach social norms. Again, we've talked about a specific example to illustrate our psychological knowledge. We're going to elaborate by continuing this idea about labelling certain people. The labels given to individuals can create a self-fulfilling prophecy and enhance their behaviour. Jehoda found that the Kwaku, Wednesday boys of the Ashanti tribe, were 3 times more likely to be involved in violent crime because they were labelled as aggressive and volatile. Schizophrenics are portrayed as dangerous by the media, but are not actually more dangerous according to Fazal et al. We've given findings from 2 different pieces of research here, from criminal and clinical psychology, in order to illustrate how labelling might be a self-fulfilling prophecy that is a negative connotation and a negative use of psychological knowledge. We're then going to form a final judgment about the role of labelling. Media campaigns to reduce stigma, like Boys Cry Too, have been designed to challenge social norms around mental health. However, those in power still have coercive power to determine which behaviours are labelled as dangerous. Our judgment here is kind of sitting on the fence. We've said that it has been positive, and understanding this has enabled us to challenge those media and stereotypes. However, we've still gone back to this idea of coercive power, showing our psychological knowledge and terminology in relation to other issues and debates. We're going to explain the use of psychological knowledge in a slightly different way. Psychology has a duty to research pressing social problems or problematic behaviours reflecting the needs of contemporary society. The nature of psychological theories and research is to be of use for society. In this explanation of the use of psychological knowledge, we're saying that it's the very foundation of psychology to be useful and to understand pressing social issues. It is a primary goal for psychology in order to reflect and be useful. Our explanation of this is going to come from our use of key questions, which means that this might be very different for you in your setting and the key questions that you have chosen to use. In the UK, we have an ageing population, making the need for research about memory and Alzheimer's a focus for psychology. The Alzheimer's Society suggests that by 2025, 1 million people will be living with dementia in the UK, and that 1 in 3 aged 65 or over will die of dementia. Here we've identified the role of an ageing population in shaping psychological knowledge, in that this has been a foundation and a focus for memory research. We're going to elaborate further on why this is such a critical issue in contemporary society. Not only is dementia costly to society in terms of price, but it is also a debilitating and frustrating disease. Atkinson and Schifrin suggest that memory has to be rehearsed in short-term memory before it can enter long-term memory. People with dementia may forget what has just been said to them, as they haven't rehearsed it properly in short-term memory, and hence it has not been properly encoded. Using specific questions, such as "Has your daughter Mary come to visit you today?" may help cue memories. We've linked the impact of dementia back into our psychological knowledge, and here we're talking about Atkinson and Schifrin and the multi-store model. We've used this to give strategies of how we might help people with dementia. And again, you might use different examples here, which is absolutely fine. We're going to give a counter-argument here, talking about how our understanding of memory may have not been used positively in society. However, an understanding of memory can also be manipulated and be used negatively in society. Leading questions and the manipulation of schema about people can be used to encourage prejudice or label individuals within society as criminal. We've given a counter-argument here in terms of leading questions, suggesting that actually we might also use this knowledge of memory in order to negatively affect society. We're going to return to this idea and make a judgment about psychology reflecting the needs of society. As the needs of society change, so does the focus for psychological research, from how we learn behaviours to candidate gene association studies as our knowledge of the human genome has developed. Here our judgment suggests that actually psychological knowledge is focused on being useful and changes depending on the needs of society. The focus on psychology being useful has then had some impacts in the level of control and power psychologists have. The impact of psychological knowledge has invested psychologists with expert power and a significant knowledge about human behaviour, which is often trusted. Here we've talked about the implications for this, the use of expert power and the fact that our knowledge as psychologists and our status as psychologists in being useful is then trusted. We're then going to evaluate this. Due to expert power, the opinions of clinicians is respected and their directions for treatment is followed by patients. We've integrated our knowledge of expert power into the role of clinicians, and we're going to explain this in more detail. Clinicians have the power to determine which thought processes are viewed as rational or irrational. They also have the power to determine the dosage of chemotherapies and which medication an individual should be put on. Clinicians also have the power to diagnose someone with a disorder or not, and therefore impact whether they have access to treatment at all. We've used a wide range of examples here to show different aspects of clinical knowledge, talking about cognitive psychology, biological psychology, and diagnosis from clinical psychology. We're going to counter this now in talking about individuals and their own free will, and therefore that it's not just a one-way process of psychology being useful, it's how people engage with it. Not all therapies are directive. Many involve the patient, as they will be responsible for continuing to action it. The patient is responsible for continuing to take their medication, engage in the behavioural activation within CBT, or the development of their desensitisation hierarchy. Here we're using our understanding of the directive nature of some therapies. When we're saying it's directive, we're saying that the psychologist or the psychiatrist is in control and the patient isn't. Whereas if we're saying it's not directive, we're saying they have some autonomy on that behaviour. We've linked this in and showed a broad range of psychological knowledge here, including terminology about behavioural activation events, so this would be homework or things to go away and do, and a desensitisation hierarchy in terms of a scale of fears from the least fearful to the most fearful. We're going to make a judgment now about our role within how useful psychological knowledge is. Those within psychological knowledge must recognise their power and their own biases so that they are recognised and reduced so as not to affect the validity of findings, theories, diagnosis or treatment. Here we've talked about a limitation of the use of psychological knowledge in terms of psychologists and their subjectivity and biases. It's time to come to a final conclusion. Psychological knowledge has ensured a development of a range of therapies from each psychological approach, making it of significant use for society. Psychological knowledge has been used to harm society and specific groups, and therefore is not inherently positive. What is researched is shaped by society and social problems to ensure that the findings have useful applications to make change. Psychology has a duty to ensure that the knowledge created is of use to society. Psychologists must be aware of their own biases in order to ensure that the psychological knowledge is accurate and in order to be of use in society. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.